Good to see you, Erik.
Thank you. Nice to see you too.
For AIIB, nature is the new infrastructure, and green certainly is a big topic related to it. Tell me more about the latest development.
What we want to think about is, when we say nature as infrastructure, is to use the full potential of nature. We know that nature can be useful for binding CO2 in the atmosphere. It can be useful for protecting against storms, protecting against erosion. There are a lot of things it can do, and we still don't know the full potential. And when we are thinking about nature and thinking about investment, we have to think about what can nature deliver, maybe before we start looking at cement and steel. So if we can use nature to, for example, prevent flooding, or we can prevent it from storms and so on, then we should use nature. Well, we have unfortunately very few examples of really successful nature as infrastructure.
How come?
No, I think that it has been difficult to get nature projects implemented, because we need to value nature properly, and that's not what we're not doing today. We don't have the right tools for doing that. In this report that we just published, we do look at some new tools for valuing nature. We're applying it to a particular project in Inner Mongolia. It's a wetland, and looking at all the things that this wetland delivers, and we call it ecosystem services, and trying to look at that. And when we do that, use that tool that really takes into account nature, we get a very different view of the project, and we actually decided that this should really be expanded, this project, rather than kept at the size.
One of the things about doing quote-unquote nature as the infrastructure is it takes time. Yeah. Now, it's not about something you would be extremely happy about in 2 or 3 years. It in fact takes much longer time. So would there be enough cash, first of all, funding for that long-term vision? Secondly, will decision makers, especially coming from local central governments in different parts of the world, be able to be determined enough to do it during their terms in the office? And thirdly, where to do it, right? Because there are so many important spots of nature in the world. They are crucial for themselves, but also for elsewhere. Yeah. So all these are pretty much difficult to decide.
No, sure. So it's complicated. We don't have all the tools we need yet. We don't have the markets for nature. We're actually organizing later this week a conference particularly on nature, and tying it also to climate and carbon. So all that needs to be in place. Some of these investments can yield very quick results. So some things like planting trees will take a long time, but there are other things one can do that really helps in the short term. So yes, it needs a lot of coordination, a lot of bringing together different interests. But also for emerging and developing countries, this is a fantastic opportunity. A lot of these assets are in emerging and developing economies, and if we started valuing them properly, they would get cheaper credit, they would have less debt burden, and so on. So there's huge opportunities, actually.
AIIB has been very keen to work with developing and emerging economies, even though your members are coming from all over the world, the so-called Global North, the so-called Global South. So tell me more about how do you see the economies in some of these emerging ones? China is an interesting example. Earlier, very fast growth rate, and now slowed down, focusing more on innovation, new quality productive forces, and etc. How do you see economies like this evolve? What does that mean for your strategies?
Of course, there are a number of emerging and developing economies in the past that managed to make it to advanced economy. The problem today is that the kind of constraints and the pressures to really join that sort of world technology frontier where all the advanced economies are, is more difficult, partly because the pace of technological change is much higher today than it was maybe 30, 40 years ago. Take AI and so on. But also the environmental and social constraints, what the climate change, biodiversity loss, social pressures. We have a lot of inequality in many of these countries. So how do we bring that about? Yes, you said it. It's innovation is the key. That's the really determinant of long-term growth. We should remember that innovation for countries is not only about finding completely new things. It's about bringing things that have been done in other places, like China did very successfully. Now China, through these ideas now of new productive forces and so on, is trying to take even a step further to really innovate things that are new for the world as a whole. And that's a very major contribution. It has to be part of a growth strategy of a country like China.
And AIIB has been diversifying your portfolio, but at the same time to work with different stakeholders, including with the private sectors, on issues of common interest.
Yeah.
So how does that work for the private sectors? Because they are extremely important stakeholders these days, especially when we are seeing more fragmented world.
Yeah, no, so first of all, as you say, multilateralism, trying to solve things, through negotiation, through cooperation, I think is really the key, and that's of course what the AIIB is about. What we have said is that we want to have 50% private sector of all total investments. So and that's the goal for 2030, and we are working towards that. And as you say, the private sector is different. Private sector requires different things, but what is very important to remember is that to really get the best out of the private sector, you need to have strong state capacity, a state that can regulate and make sure that there's not that procurement is done the right way and so on. All that is so critical to get the best out of the private sector. And we won't be able to solve all these challenges like climate change, like biodiversity loss, without participation from the private sector.
The other thing is about the debt issue. Now you hear from the rhetorics a lot that certain countries, after building infrastructure or attracting foreign investors, have been in the depth of debts. Now, some of them might be true, but the degree is questionable. Others might just be rhetorics than the realities. But having said that, though, for emerging and developing countries, what is the reality AIIB is looking at? Secondly, what do you think might be some of the good practices you have witnessed in some of the economies you're working with?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very real challenge. About 50 countries or so are facing very serious debt issues. And in a sense, it's remarkable that so little crisis has happened so far. And it tells you a little bit how more sophisticated these countries have actually become in managing their risks and so on. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we need to do something about these debt levels, because it is crippling them, and particularly as we want them to do a lot of new investments in new greener technologies and so on. We need to deal with it. I think what is essential, there's something called a common framework that was developed particularly with the IMF at the core. I think the kind of set of procedures that were set out in that are very good, because it kind of brings in all the interested parties. Of course, a problem that we have is that we don't have a very good framework for bringing in the private sector, and that's where really we need to spend more time developing that, because what happened over the last 20 years is that a lot of what used to be government loans has instead become private sector loans, and we need to find ways of dealing with that.
Thank you so much, Erik. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.